Welcome, everyone. My name is Nahed Mansour, and I'm the Curator of Programs and Education at the Gardner Museum. Thank you for joining us today for a virtual artist tour of Shary Boyle's solo exhibition titled Outside the Palace of Me. The exhibition is on view at the Gardner Museum until May 15th, and we hope that this virtual exploration inspires you to visit the museum and see the work in person. You'll notice your mics and videos are muted and the chat option has been disabled. There will be a Q&A following today's program, so we invite you to send us questions through the Q&A function at any point. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that for thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land and ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Petun, and the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation. The community we work in is the home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to learn and live on this land. I'll now welcome our guest speaker, acclaimed artist Shary Boyle. Shary Boyle is from the Scarborough area of Toronto. She is the recipient of the 2021 Honorary Doctorate of Fine Arts from the Ontario College of Art and Design University, where she graduated in 1994. Developing a studio practice centered on figurative drawing, painting, and live performance. Creating deeply imaginative and idiosyncratic unsettling worlds, Boyle was an early innovator of live drawing techniques using overhead projectors referencing shadow puppetry and cell animation. Boyle activates her practice through collaboration and mentorship, engaging other creative communities and disciplines with a characteristically inclusive spirit. Boyle has received the Gershon Iskowitz and Nidishan Award and represented Canada at the Venice Biennial in 2013. Outside the Palace of Me marks her first solo Canadian museum tour since Flesh and Blood, curated by Louise Derry, debuted at the Art Gallery of Ontario in 2010. I'll now turn off my video and mic and hand it over to Shary.
Hello, thank you, Nahed, and thank you to the Gardner Museum and Sequoia Miller, who curated this exhibition with me, and all the wonderful people I worked with to make this happen. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, cool. Here we go. Let me know, anybody, if there's any technical issues. And I also really want to invite people out there. I'm so sorry that I can't see your face because it's always so strange to talk to you without seeing you. But to please ask questions. This whole exhibition experience for me has been one, and actually my whole practice is about wishing to communicate, wishing to have these kind of conversations and exchanges in real life. I process the world through my art, and this exhibition has so much to say and so much I'd love to have a conversation about with real people, a back and forth exchange. But for right this moment, I'm just going to be leading you through, but please do send your questions, and I'd love to reserve some time at the end to respond. What you're looking at this moment is the outside invitational kind of space in the Gardner Museum up on the 3rd floor as you enter what has been reconfigured to move away from a typical gallery experience into more of one of a kind of internal world that I imagine as a theater. So you see these really beautiful inky blue velvet curtains that we had the Ontario Stage Company create just for this exhibition, that's their work, is usually doing stage and scrim curtains for the theater. Once you step inside, you'll notice you're in a completely unconventional drop ceiling, small space, which I imagine as a dressing room. I worked with Shannon Lee Doyle, who's a theater set designer, on the exhibition design for this show. I was commissioned in around 2018, before COVID, before so many things happened that have just kind of mounted one on the next for all of us to try to contend with in the outer world. Historically, things have never stopped, but it feels since around 2016, I feel like there's been a concentration of events that has taken me outside of my own internal imagination and the way I had typically made art up until that point, into really thrust into like a external confrontation with what was happening politically and in the larger kind of news media. And so I really want to create a space that wasn't a typically passive experience of going out to an exhibition that one is an audience member of and just quietly looks at things along a wall or in the middle of a space in a big exhibition room, but instead kind of enters a smaller, more intimate space where they're asked to what their role is in the larger experience of looking at art and an exhibition, and how they might be a player themselves. So as you move into this space, I wanted it to be more theatrical and to kind of almost be a dressing room. If anybody has been involved with the theater, you know, before, if you are a performer, if you're an engaged, if you're playing a role like we all do in real life, you are having a moment to prepare and to kind of confront yourself in a mirror, whether that's stage makeup, costume, what have you, to put yourself together, to assemble yourself before you step onto the public's stage. So I'm also thinking a lot about how we play roles in our own lives to each other and to ourselves. And the first moment in this exhibition is the dressing room with these 3 busts. You'll see many works in the show. I worked with a massive range of materials. Some of this work I make by myself in the studio, like these 3 works. Some of them I work with people that have different skills than I to together create a really large, say, sculpture that I don't have the electronic or the kind of some of the material specialties. So it's a range of relationships in this exhibition. And right here, the first one is kind of confronting these 3 figures that are looking through what seems like a smoked kind of glass back at you. But you'll see as you move into the space that it's a very special kind of glass that they're looking through. But we have the opportunity first off to look at them closely. And you'll see that each one of their eyes has a different kind of intervention happening. Whether on the left, there's these kind of eyelashes that seem a little bit intense. In the middle, the eyes are actually a reflective surface looking back at you, you know, kind of volley of back and forth reflection. And on the right, there's these tusks coming out, going back into the eye space. So I'm really commenting on looking, seeing, viewing, witnessing, surveilling, and the kind of way we look at each other and the way we look at ourselves and the way we look at each other looking at us. So there's a lot of that in this exhibition. Once you move past the drawing room, or the dressing room, and you move up a ramp onto the back of the stage, and as you turn the corner, you realize you're under a proscenium arch, and this would be the typical view. This is a fisheye lens photography, and it's much brighter than the regular shows, a little bit more dimly lit. But once you are under that arch, you're really facing the exhibition space as a stage, as the experience of being a performer that is going to be walking down this 18-inch stage, black shiny surface made just to kind of recreate that experience. And on either side, you have a series of smaller ceramic sculptures that kind of operate as a chorus or your fellow players. And as you move down to the front of the stage where you see some kind of footlights and some other situation happening that draws your attention, you can kind of look to the left or the right and engage with these smaller, more intimate kind of internal dramas that I've created in different forms of clay. There's a lot of really wonderful viewpoints in this exhibition, and strangely, a lot of refractive surfaces, like even plexiglass, that create kind of divisions and mirroring effects and shoot light all through the space that kind of endlessly kind of gets you to consider multiple perspectives. Here would be one of the first smaller ceramic works that you'll encounter, called the Potter. And from the front view on the left, you'll see it's a figure in terracotta, kind of sitting in a traditional stance of pot, like that, the potter's wheel. but instead they have a stack of pots, each one representing a kind of different global tradition, from China to Ghana, France, Greece, Peru, Egypt, these kind of ancient vessels that can be found all over the planet, and wherever humans have kind of rose up, they engage with the clay of the ground that they live in and eventually quickly make vessels. And so this idea of the vessel and the kind of cultural expression that, say, now archaeologists kind of look for the first signs of a cultural kind of identity would be in the pot shards that you find in this area that people have been living for millennia. This kind of unification, this global tradition, I wanted to talk about that and how we all have a connection to the earth that we live on and that we're born on, and how much that connection to land creates the identity of the individual and the community collective. So in this piece, I wanted to use terracotta for the figure. And if you look at it from the side, terracotta, because it's baked earth, it's really kind of the closest thing to like just scooping the earth into a shape, almost like we're made of clay. From the side, you see this beautiful, more, these elegant expressions of culture, but there's no head on the figure. And that is really talking about how culture creates our identity. One of the next sculptures you'll see and you come across, and some people that have seen the show have, messaged me and said this is one of their favorites because it's really interactive, and it's, I was really trying to do what I could to engage people and understand that art isn't something that you just have to passively look at and imagine and perhaps feel kind of like you've checked some intellectual box by understanding the references in a very exclusive manner. There's art is also something that is supposed to be, in a way, a prompt, or can be a prompt for you to do some deep reflection on your own life, your own experience, and whatever you bring to it. So in this way, I was thinking about how the artist, and you'll see many times in this show, I'm considering the role of artists in society, as that's how I've interacted with the world my whole life. So the idea of how an artist creates their identity is worked through in this kind of porcelain reference to some kind of old European figurative sculpture. You'll see I mounted a mirror, and there's this character of the painter, and she's got a tiny little paintbrush and a little tin can of paintbrushes on the ground, and she's looking into this mirror almost like she's doing a self-portrait. And you'll see on the left a detail where the face has been unpainted. There's nothing there as yet. But on the very right, you'll see on the mirror, I've painted the features in black ink. So depending on where you situate yourself as a viewer in this piece, you kind of have to bob around until you line up the features on the mirror with this reflection of a blank face behind it and create the individual. It's like a fun game, but it's also just a really simple metaphor for how we're making ourselves, constantly making and unmaking and continuing to make throughout our lives. Oasis is one of my favorite sculptures on the stage. It's really, in my mind, a beautiful homage to the gender spectrum of inclusivity, and how I personally have never felt in any way attached to an idea of a binary in terms of gender. I've always felt that I contained a real, like the full spectrum as an individual. So I always felt very, had a hard time slotting myself into, a binary of male or female. And obviously this is a conversation that people have all over the world in different stages as history progresses. Right now, I just felt, in terms of antiquities, when I think of the idea of digging up clay, digging up ceramics, which lasts so long and is such a clue to culture, I love the idea of making like a beautiful homage to a kind of fully spectrum gendered body, where there's such a kind of elegance and pride, and something almost you'd want to worship. And if imagining in the future someone digging this up and wondering, what culture did this belong to? What is this saying? I wanted to be something full of pride, instead of how often so many cultures make the body full of shame. On the left side of the stage, you'll see a whole further series. There's 10 in all. I just quickly want to show you a few of the references that go into these images. On the right here, you'll see an old kind of musical playbill that says by image in the middle. That's kind of one of the main references I used to create this flatback Staffordshire referenced figure. And Staffordshire flatbacks are a type of ceramics that happened in England, which is one of my kind of cultural background forms that were made to sit on a mantle, so they're flat on the back. You look at them from the front. This piece is called By My Image. It's a figurine seller, which used to be a thing. People be on the corner selling, hawking these figurines. They used to call them images as opposed to figurines. This is very interesting. There's a popular ballad at the time in the 1800s called By Image, and people would like play it on their piano, and it would be about one of these sellers of cheap kind of figurines for the working class and middle class people to buy and decorate their homes or their cottages with. And this figure in particular, I was thinking about how we've always created images of ourselves, and every culture, every people in the world have always tried to understand ourselves or create mythologies around ourselves or our spiritual traditions through some form of image. To better understand ourselves or tell our stories or invent stories. So this particular character is so interesting to me because John Taylor, who this figure is based on the left, was someone who was born Mary Ann Talbot, but in the 18th century England started presenting as John Taylor. So a very early transgender history out of England, a very interesting story about this kind of, some people wonder if it's even mythological, whether this person really existed or not, but there tends to be like a fair amount of kind of information or like these beautiful prints of the time. Definitely a strong story existed. And so I wanted to kind of celebrate this really interesting person in the figure of the flatback, which was really at the time used to kind of create stories around individuals for people to kind of talk about and engage with and integrate. And then at the very bottom, you'll see the Venus del Fall holes, which is one of the earliest kind of sculptures that exists, made out of a type of bone that's been carved, and it seems like a fertility figure that's tens of thousands of years old. And so I had this flatback kind of Staffordshire figure that's talking about John Taylor, that's talking about the idea of the human image, how we understand each other, that's got a little kind of tray of tchotchkes that they're selling of individual kind of characters that represent who knows what of what we think about ourselves. And then on the other hand, there's this image of fertility, which is an ancient representation of how we used to think about ourselves that we've lost touch with. And I'm constantly thinking about ancient history and what role art played in all cultures that we don't have a connection to necessarily. We don't know exactly how to interpret what exactly those figures meant, but we know in our instinctual selves that they were greatly powerful, they're sacred, they were very important, and that art had a kind of elevated relationship to community that I sometimes am starving for now. As you move towards the end of the stage, you're seeing this kind of sculpture in the footlights and some paintings on the wall and other works behind it. This sculpture is called Centering. It's built on a pottery wheel. I worked with Grant Heaps, who's a costume designer and a textile artist in Toronto. He works at the National Ballet of Canada. I wanted to engage with him as a friend and a maker to work on a costume for kind of a stack of pots that were going to be dressed like a figure and mounted on the top of the pottery wheel, so that when the pottery wheel spins, the costume flies out like a dancer. It's a kind of rumination on celebrity and fame and status culture. It's, elegantly and bedazzled dress in like a spectacular costume. And when you put money in the little coin machine there, you get 15 seconds to hit the pedal and it'll spin. You're looking to the right of the stage, you see a number of drawings, and drawings is a practice that I've started out my early life, and most of my 20s I was drawing and painting, and I've kind of moved from oil painting and drawing with say graphite or into a watercolor and ink and gouache technique on paper. And I've been going in and out of that for many years. And it was a delight for me to get to present a series of these drawings, I call them, when many people are more familiar perhaps with my ceramic work now, because I've been focusing on that quite a bit for years. But you'll see here too, a large scale, full size figure that's maybe she's almost 6 feet tall. So she's just a little bit like, you know, a good statuesque kind of presence in the gallery with these narrative images all around. And I really do see Judy, as this figure is called, as kind of a representation of some of the iconic roles or theatrical kind of tropes, or even gender roles that we see in society and in kind of popular culture that that people identify with women. And misogyny being one of the deepest rooted and universal kind of experiences of othering and violence that we do as humans to each other. I really wanted to try to process some of that through this figure. Throughout the show, you'll see kind of me working through subjects and of social injustice, considering my role in them, considering my relationship to it, but also really wanting to put out images that prompt and question without really telling you exactly what you should be feeling or what is the right or the wrong way to respond. I really want to open dialogue because I want art to be functional, because I want it to be open enough that everybody is welcome to the table, regardless of your experience, because I don't believe that we can actually move forward in society with so many myriad of problems that we have without having an ability to have a conversation with the person that you might, or the subject or the kind of issue that you might be in conflict with. So there's that kind of really beautiful one-on-one or social premise of coming to the table together and talking. So here we have Judy. I wanted to also work with kind of aesthetics of the carnival or the entertainment kind of complex. You've got a Looney Tunes thing, circle in the background, which is an old kind of comic logo that some people from an earlier generation will identify. And that's really talking about the kind of that's all folks nature of some of these intractable problems that we have around race and gender, that in terms of inequity. So I wanted to kind of have that popular culture thing. She's made in wax, like a wax figure, like a Ripley's Believe It or Not, like a kind of character that you see again and again. There's like a witch, there's the wife, there's an activist, and on her hand there's a marionette, which I think of as the worrier. And I think of how often women are kind of in the role of the worrier, taking on the things that are the most concerning, that are I see so much anxiety in women, whether it's in mothers or in just kind of everyday experiences of being female, having to be so concerned and taking things on. Often there's a kind of taking on the world aspect of many women, or people I know that identify as women. There's something around that culturally. The puppets. The one puppet, hand puppet on Judy, is called Judy. That piece is called Judy because I'm not only talking about theater and kind of the central characters, a little bit of a backstage kind of tech hand that someone would be behind the scenes in the theater, all dressed in black, but she has different characters on her hands. One of them is called Judy from the Punch and Judy puppet show. That's a really ancient kind of British trope around deeply ingrained gender roles. Here's Punch, who kind of invented the term slapstick comedy, and it really came from a little stick that he holds in his hand that he beats his wife with through the show. And the show is something that you can see anywhere throughout Europe, and particularly in England in puppet shows for children, like for the past 500 years. So here's Punch, and he's holding kind of, I've merged him with some Catholic imagery. This is called Drag Show. Really wanted to try to create an image that asks a viewer, or suggests or prompts, or kind of evokes something in the viewer to question the contemplative look on the figure's face as they look into the mirror, and they're kind of considering, you see someone contemplating themselves, contemplating their relationship to this mask, this role. It's kind of suggesting that maybe they're about to do a performance of some kind with all the, the mirrored lights and the makeup. There's gender at question, there's race at question, there's age at question, and all of those things and how they might interact and how they impact and affect the individual. I really see this as a intersectional image of open-ended kind of question. I think a lot of people will have different responses to it and could have really interesting interpretations of what they imagine this character might be thinking. And in that, it's an exercise of empathy. There's also some references to real theater and circus and other kind of popular entertainment where we're examining our own social cultural roles. This one in particular is referencing the 1945 film Children of Paradise, which is a Michel Carnet French film, known as one of the most beautiful French films ever made in history. It's very extraordinary and follows the story of this really gentle kind of mime that has a terrible relationship with his father, and in the end has a kind of act of vengeance against this very abusive patriarchal figure as he kind of enlarges into this fully realized kind of genderless artist. The muse and the kind of imagination and the kind of beauty of this figure, yet is enacting this violence in order to kind of, erase this other thing that have kept him so shrunk down. So this is my interpretation of a moment in the film. And I want to turn everybody just for a moment to the Gardner website, where if you go on to the programming that Nahed and so many other people at the Gardner have come together to make really beautiful programming for this exhibition in conversation with some of my ideas. And one of them is the Children of Paradise is screening at the Français l'Alliance in, when is it? My thing is above it, but it's in, April 12th. I'll be there. If anybody wants to come, get a ticket. It's so rare to see this film in the big screen. It's going to be magnificent. It's such a beautiful thing. And don't we all need something to do to take our minds off for a moment, the reality of our world. Let me just make sure this is the right one. This is called The Procession. And The Procession is very interesting. I made this work, the very last piece for this exhibition, after working for 3 years on this show. I made it in kind of trying to synthesize the idea of community collective action and why we come together away from the state, away from the government, in our own terms, on our own ground, to rise up, whether we need to do this culturally as a kind of ritual around death or celebration or joy. It could be a parade, it could be a funeral march, it could be the Santa Claus parade, it could be Caravana here in Toronto, or as a protest march. And there's been so many kind of examples of this that people have been watching just the last few years, but over history. This is one of the things that we can do as individuals to come together and empower ourselves and make change. And so I wanted to do an homage and a celebration of this gathering, but really try to figure out how to incorporate joy, celebration, and the vitality of coming together, as well as the significance of political kind of activism and taking back individuals' power. So those hard parts, the painful parts, the rising up and the fighting parts, as well as the joyful communion and collectivity parts. I call it the procession. And since I made it, I've discovered that there's actually all sorts of artists that have made artworks around this kind of their own version of this theme that they've also titled the procession. So as it turns out, this is a long-standing tradition that will stretch into the future of artist interpretations. You can see the painting on the back wall of the shadows. I wanted to to kind of create like a kind of spotlight situation where you imagine like the lights on the stage really punchy and bright and kind of circus-like colors, but with the shadows distorted and stretched, because I really see this piece as something that connects to history and all the people that have taken to the streets throughout the ages. And it also stretched in front of us of all the people that will need to work together individually and together as collective community to make change and to celebrate. It's many small pieces, over 30 small. This is a very beautiful stoneware ceramic in black, cone 6. It's like a porcelain. And it, to me, I really thought about shadow puppets when I originally was considering this work. I was thinking about making it with real lights and real shadows. So I really wanted the clay to be black to kind of create shape and shadow and silhouette almost. So you can see these hands making shapes like birds. So you can see that there is already incorporating kind of shadow puppet ideas inside this procession. And here are some of the individual figures you see, some of them marching with flags of unknown kind of intent. You see that I wanted to create a space that was incredibly inclusive for all ages and all abilities and kind of these strange, almost invented and marginalized characters that also could represent spiritual traditions, mythologies, beliefs that have been erased perhaps or silenced that I wanted to bring back. That's something that I have a long tradition in my own practice of trying to do, to try to bring things that have been silenced back into reality to remember as a remembrance. The third slide is this kind of tent-like hand situation where I was really thinking of real things of real life, like the encampment support network that happened here in Toronto, of people collectively getting together to try to bring some respite to the people that were camping out and still remain houseless in Toronto parks as the COVID kind of goes into shelters and people prefer and make their decisions not to live inside of temporary kind of housing that the government has so little options for them that are safe. And so people came together to help their fellow citizens with water, with like resources, and to try to protect them from overzealous violence that is ingrained in so many of our police and military and our CMP institutions in Canada, which on the right, you see this kind of authority, hyper-militarized, hyper-violent situation of these officers that are integrated into these movements. So whenever people are trying to rise up to collectively gain power and kind of solace and community together, you can never, sooner or later the state will come in to keep the status quo. And so you will see throughout procession there will be some figures like those men on the right with their guns. As you move through the space and past procession, you'll see on the left these 3 beautiful theater chairs that are incredibly comfortable that I have on loan from the Mirvish Theater. They're the old Royal Alexander seats that were ripped out for renovation a few years back. And I was lucky enough to find them in a warehouse and ask for a tour loan. And so you can sit on these seats that for 100 years, thousands of people saw tens of thousands of performances on. So there's a real amazing energy locked into those chairs. And I have a soundtrack for the exhibition of music that relates to the themes of the show. And also all of it has a very personal relationship to my practice. And I'm, so incredibly grateful to music for keeping me and so many people alive over the years, right? With the spirit kind of strengthening and inspirational power of music. So you can sit in that chair and quietly scroll through and choose a song that will really change. Each song will change the nature of how you're viewing the work around you. White Elephant is a 9-foot seated sculpture that I made for the Contemporary Art Forum Kitchener and area. They commissioned me 3 years ago as well, at the same time that the Gardner invited me to do this exhibition, and I saw the really good potential to create a really large public sculpture for Kafka, their sculpture biennial, that would be in the themes and incorporated into the tour with the Gardner for all sorts of practical reasons, but for the most important reason is that I did not want this piece to have just one life for like a month in Kitchener and then go into storage or disappear. I wanted this to be something that could be, again, a conversation starter, and intentionally, very specifically around whiteness and the cultural and kind of racial awareness and the slow kind of awakening of many people in Canada who are white of their own racial identity and what that means, what it implies, what the history is, how it affects other people. And that conversation is so underdeveloped and there's so much discomfort with it that I wanted to create a work that would engage people wherever place they are at with it, to start talking. And ideally white people with other white people, because there's so much available education and voices that have to continue to be centered around racism and white supremacy that come from the Black and Indigenous and people of color community. It's white people have to engage with this dialogue. I believe they have to be firmly involved with a conversation around who they are and how their white supremacy can be dismantled by white people. You can see that the piece, I worked with a brilliant mechatronic designer, Colin Harry, to develop a motor that would spin this head at random moments. You don't know when it's going to happen. It's on a motion sensor. And otherwise, it's incredibly static and awkward, this figure. And you can see here on the left, here's Colin and Alexis McMaster. Did I say McMaster? Sorry. Mackenzie. On the left, we were working together to create some of the sculpture, and Colin's doing the kind of software programming for the motor. And this was my making of here. And some of my inspiration came from The Exorcist, the figure with the head spinning, because of the terror that white supremacy and the violence that so many endless kind of histories that it implies and that we're dealing with all the time and thinking about. But also this idea of what is white and how's that working for you, and let's talk about it. So I did have a Instagram as well that is kind of specifically about this piece, called White Elephant _2021. And I have just been slowly posting things over the year around my years around my research and kind of news items that talk about whiteness. There's two drawings on either side of this section that talk about the intersection of gender and whiteness. And here there is a kind of binary where male on the left and female on the right. And I'm thinking about those histories as quite a challenge to myself as a person, just to really try to unpack so much of how I could make an image about that incorporated some of the aspects that were specific to gender and the relation of the kind of building of the identity of whiteness. And I'm talking about North America, I'm talking about Canada. I can't, there's so many cultures of whiteness actually, but I can only investigate my own. The one on the left is called Lone Shooter, and the one on the right is called The Settler. There's a book that's been produced by Art Canada Institute called The Outside of Palace of Me, and it's a companion to this exhibition. And I bring it up here. It's sold at the Gardner gift store. You can get it at Art Canada Institute. Any kind of local bookstore will order it in or have it. This is easily accessible. And I really strongly want to encourage anybody that is compelled and interested in the show and wants to have a greater understanding of it to not only get the brochure when you're at the museum, because that is where any of the didactic text is. I chose not to put any text in the museum at all, so that people really do have to rely on their own interpretation. But here in the book, you're going to get this section at the back called the Visual Glossary, which is a whole 10 different individual pieces written about by me, about my process, my references, and my research into the works. And it really is important for me to kind of share this stuff and have a conversation about it. I wish we had all the time in the world to have this conversation, because that's what it's about, is that these images are they're so rich, and there's so much to say. And I know that anybody looking at it, depending on where they're at, will kind of bring their own feelings about it and wouldn't isn't it time we had these conversations in a free way, in a way that we weren't so freaked out and scared to have them? And so I really like the idea that this isn't a museum, you know, a museum of ceramics where people might not be used to encountering this. But I think that actually people are very hungry. And I think many white people are very hungry to have these conversations about their own culture and how it developed and where they're at now and what they can do. And this brings us to the last image in the show, where you're on the other side of the looking glass from when you entered in the dressing room. And what looked like three figures kind of looking through a glass, it turns out were three figures looking at a mirror. And you can see here that the back of each of these figures is going to give you access to the internal or interior side of the sculpture. And so there's a lot of metaphor throughout this exhibition, inviting people to imagine what someone else might be experiencing, what it could possibly be to be somebody else, or how people might be imagining you, and then how we present ourselves to the world. And so these are not definite questions. They're so open, and there's so much room for exploration and kind of movement. And I think that sometimes humans are so guilty of wanting to have a rigid, definite explanation of things to kind of create meaning and just hold it there. And as an artist, my biggest privilege and the thing that keeps me going is that I can create so much ambiguity that suggests possibility and kind of unfixes meanings so that I can consider spectrums of possibilities, and also bring beauty to these conversations that sometimes can be so painful, that have hurt so many people. But also the wonder of making art and the materials and the skills, and how much joy there is in that. It's a prayer to put this much work and time into art. You don't do that unless you approach it with a real sacred intention. And so I hope that that intention comes through to all who see the work, and I hope that they feel that kind of belief and that respect that happens when I make this work with the people I make it together in our relationships. And I hope that kind of affords anybody going through to feel respected, to feel like their own dignity and their own freedom to be who they are, and to kind of hopefully open up all these conversations to have with yourself and your own self-reflection, or with your friends or the people you talk to. I think that's it for now. If there's room, I'd love to have some questions if there's time.
Thank you so much, Shary, for all of that. You did an incredible job summarizing an incredibly rich and complex exhibition in a short period of time. So thank you for that. And I also thank you for mentioning some of the upcoming programs and highlighting the beautiful catalog that supplements this exhibition. And just a reminder to everyone that the exhibition is open at the Gardner Museum until May 15th. So please do join us in the space and treat yourself to these works, and please come by and visit, and also look through our beautiful catalog and choose to buy one if you can through our beautiful gift shop.